Okay, welcome back to part 15 of the series on elementary logic. I'm covering module 2, 2.5, failure of traditional classification propositions. So, up till now, whatever we have done, most of it was study of traditional logic. Now, we will learn in this particular video why it is no longer enough to use traditional logic and why modern logic is necessary. We'll look at the limitations and the failures. So, the traditional Aristotelian classification of propositions into categorical and conditional forms, which we studied earlier in the earlier videos, has been a cornerstone of classical logic, that is, traditional logic. However, in modern logic and philosophical discourse, several limitations and failures of this classification have been identified, particularly when applied to complex or nuanced reasoning. Below is an in depth explanation of these shortcomings. Let's look at the key limitations and the failures. First, there are total 8 of them. We'll go step by step, try to understand. Now, what kind of question can come in the exam paper based on this particular topic of the limitations and the failures of the traditional logic? So, we have to write point wise these limitations and failures. So, first of all, the traditional logic did not address the quantifier complexity. Now, quantifiers, as we studied, was four types. One was all, no, some are, and some are not. Now, this is what it focused on: simple quantifiers like all, some, or none, that is, no. The problem here is that it fails to handle complex quantifiers such as most, few, exactly three, or almost all. Now the statement most students in the class are attentive cannot be accurately expressed in traditional fourfold classification, which we have already learned in the previous videos. Now, if you do not understand and you have directly jumped onto this particular part of the video and you are not able to understand what is fourfold classification of propositions, then you will have to go back and watch the entire video in its series from video number 1. Let's look at the second point of the failure, or what it lacks, the traditional logic, what it lacks. So there's a lack of support for multi-term proposition. In traditional logic, it used to primarily deal with propositions involving a symbol, subject, and predicate. So far, we have just talked about very simple statements like A is a father, or the sky is blue, the birds can fly, the birds have feather. So birds and feather, sky and blue, and so on. So this is what we have learned in traditional logic till now. But the problem is that the statements are not always such simple statements. They could be with multiple subjects or multiple predicates. For example, all judges who are experienced and fair are respected. So now there are two of them, experienced and fair. So there are two predicates that cannot be handled effectively by the traditional logic. Next, now what are we going to do while understanding this is that then we'll see what we can utilize or what new logical terms we can use or logic what different topics can we cover to understand logic in more detail. Third, neglect of relational statements. So traditional logic operates on categorical forms that assume a simple relationship between the subject and the predicate. This is what the categorical form indicates. Now the problem is that it fails to capture relational statements involving multiple entities. Example, John is taller than Mary involves a relational predicate, that is taller than, that does not fit neatly into categorical classification. So we have less than, greater than, greater than and equal to, less than and equal to, and so on. Failure to represent conditional propositions in detail. So traditional logic treats conditional propositions, that is if then, superficially as if P then Q. Now this does not analyze the internal structure of the antecedent. This is known as antecedent, this is known as consequent. Once again, if you have not understood this, go back to the previous videos. Everything is explained in the previous videos. Don't directly jump here, because logic is difficult to understand if your clarity of the concepts is not there. Or that is, your concepts are not clear, then you will not understand. So the traditional logic does not analyze the internal structure of the antecedent or the consequent, which leads to ambiguity. For example, if a contract is signed and witnessed, it is valid. It involves multiple conditions that traditional logic cannot dissect effectively. Limited scope in handling modal propositions. Traditional logic assumes that propositions are always either true or false, or both are true, both are false, and so on, different combinations of true and false. Problem is that it cannot handle modal concepts like necessity, possibility, or probability. For example, it is possible that the defendant is innocent. One cannot say for sure that he is guilty or not guilty. And it involves qualifiers, modal qualifiers that traditional logic ignores. So there are a lot of issues with the traditional logic. We'll have to move on to the modern logic. Sixth, ambiguity in natural language statement. Traditional logic assumes propositions have a clear and precise meaning, and the problem with that is that the natural language is often ambiguous, as we know, and traditional logic struggles to interpret nuanced meanings. Example, the statement, lawyers are expensive. They could mean anything. They could mean big lawyers are expensive, famous lawyers are expensive, well-known lawyers are, or maybe Supreme Court lawyers are expensive. All lawyers are expensive, or some lawyers are expensive, leading to confusion. So traditional logic will only have all or some or no lawyers are expensive. So basically it is very limited in that sense. There are challenges with negative propositions. Traditional logic focuses on simple negations, that is no SRP. The problem is it cannot handle complex negations like it is not true that some S are not P. Example, statements with double negatives or implicit negations are difficult to classify. Eighth, ignorance of context and pragmatics. Traditional logic treats propositions as isolated from their context. Problem. In law and everyday reasoning, context often determines the meaning and the implications of a statement. Very true. All contracts are valid may not hold in contexts involving illegal or unethical terms. So we cannot use this if it involves illegal or unethical terms. Then the contract will become void or invalid. Failures in legal reasoning. Traditional classification often falls short when applied to legal arguments where there is relation involved, there are conditions or conditional reasoning, probabilistic statements, and contextual nuances. So relational proposition is like party A owes money to party B. Conditional reasoning involves if party A breaches, there is a condition, then the party B can sue, requires detailed analysis. So just looking at this statement if then does not help, it requires further detailed analysis. Probabilistic statements like it is likely that the accused is guilty are very common in law and used nowadays. Contextual nuances. Example, all citizens have rights except under martial law. are crucial. So using context is also very important, which is not there in the traditional logic. Modern advancements addressing these failures. Now this is very important. So predicate logic. So this kind of logic extends traditional logic. So traditional logic is no doubt useful, but it has many limitations, and therefore the predicate logic introduce concepts or quantifiers like for all or for some exist. So these help in expanding the scope of the traditional logic, which we have studied in the previous video. You can go back to the previous video and check for the quantifiers for all, for some exist, that is for some x there is some existence, and variables for greater precisions. Modal logic, it incorporates concepts like possibility and necessity, which is not there in the traditional logic. Relational logic handles relationships between multiple entities, and fuzzy logic deals with propositions that are not strictly true or false but have degrees of truth. So all these four logics, which are predicate logic, modal logic, relational logic, and fuzzy logic. Now, let us look at few of the examples illustrating the limitations. The complex quantifier example. Few students failed the test. Now you use the few. This cannot be represented in traditional AEIO form. Relational statement example. The defendant owes money to the plaintiff. So there's a relationship between the defendant and the plaintiff of owing the money. It requires a relational predicate, not a simple categorical structure. Context dependent examples. All citizens have rights. Ignores exceptions or the context where it is being said. That is, exception could include like wartime where there are no rights, or emergencies when the rights are curtailed. Conclusion. While the traditional classification of propositions laid the foundation for logical analysis, yes, traditional logic laid the foundation. It is no longer sufficient to address the complexity of the modern reasoning, particularly in areas like legal analysis. Modern logical frameworks provide tools to overcome these limitations, making them indispensable for nuanced reasoning in law and other disciplines. Thank you so much for patiently going through the entire video. If it was helpful, as usual, share it with your friends. Do like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much. Bye bye.